Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be talking about the events of April 1993 in Waco, Texas, with the Branch Davidians and David Koresh. You know, Chris, as I look at this and reflect back on this 51-day standoff between federal authorities and the religious people, the religious group in the Mount Carmel compound there. That's a long standoff, and of course, as we know, it didn't end well.
Yeah, you know, Ray, there are certain moments in history when all of us know of an event that takes place, and it's one of those, I remember where I was when such and such happened. For our parents, they remembered when President Kennedy was assassinated. You and I, we remember where we were when the Challenger exploded. And we also recall this day in 1993, when we turned on the news and we saw this compound that was engulfed in flames, and we saw tanks and men with guns, and we just had no idea that this is something that was taking place in Texas and not maybe across the world. And it all kind of revolved around the government and religion, and it asked and still asks today, you know, what is a true separation of church and state? And also, what are the amendments that people have to be able to exercise freedom of speech, or where the government says you've gone too far? And so that's why I think the story is so fascinating for us to talk about today, as we kind of look at the beginnings and then sort of the ramifications that the tragedy at Waco had. Yes, it was 51 days. However, there was a lot that took place before and a lot that took place after that causes us to need to address this topic as history that we should know.
Yeah, and you know, you mentioned the First Amendment and all those things about freedom of religion, freedom of speech. You know, this is still a very controversial topic. If you spend any time on Google or YouTube looking up the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas, you're going to find a lot of people who still have very strong feelings about the events of April 1993. Where do you want to start, Chris? I mean, there's so many different places we can begin. Of course, this was a group there in Texas that had branched off from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. David Koresh, of course, himself, born in 1959 as Vernon Wayne Howell. He becomes involved in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and he spends some time, you know, at Los Angeles trying to pursue a career in the music industry before returning to Texas and taking up there at the Waco compound called Mount Carmel there in Waco, Texas.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that David Koresh didn't create the Branch Davidians.
Right.
He basically assumed the leadership through some nefarious ways, if you will. You know, the Branch Davidians, as you said, were a breakaway group of Seventh-day Adventists. They arrived in Waco, Texas in 1935, and their, I guess, original founder, if you will, was a man whose name was Victor Houteff. And he had actually been expelled from the Los Angeles Church of the Seventh-day Adventist. And he had some really strong theological views, some of that being some of the similar views of Seventh-day Adventists, that the second coming of Christ was really close, that it was going to happen at any moment. But then he went a step further and said that he was the guy who was going to be the prophet that will, you know, preview, if you will, the second coming. And so he took the followers and they found this property there in Waco that they called Mount Carmel. But he really thought, we're just going to be here for a short time, because within a year, he thought Christ was going to return. They were going to go to the Holy Land and they were going to meet him. And yet what happens is, for like the next 40 some years, they're still there. But as they're there, they're growing and they're becoming more and more set on their beliefs and on their particular ways. And that's where in 1981, this 22-year-old aspiring rock musician that you mentioned, Vernon Wayne Howe, arrives and quickly said, not only do I want to be a part of this church, but I want to be the leader of this church. And the victor, the leader, dies, leaves the church in ownership of his wife, who becomes I guess you would say, prophetess. And then Vernon Howe, aka David Koresh, he then seduces her. She's like 70 years of age. He's 22, and he seduces her and basically says, God has brought us together so that we can have, you can be my spiritual wife, and we can have a child. And he then, says that I am going to be this prophet. And Ray, I think that as he takes those ideas, he starts pushing them onto these new members, but also she has a son,
yes,
who actually wants to be in charge too. So there's this quasi spiritual leader battle that's going on, which will ultimately pave the way, I think, for the government to come in.
Yeah, her son George Roden, after her death, he and David Koresh have a bit of a conflict over who's going to be the leader of this Branch Davidian group there in Waco. And Koresh actually leaves and takes some of his followers with him to a different location. They stay away for a while, but he returns with a group of followers in 1987, and in a very weird set of events, he ends up killing, well, not killing, but severely injuring George Roden. And he shoots George Roden, is basically what he does. And he is actually charged with attempted murder, from which he's acquitted. So all the way back in 1987, David Koresh had shown signs of being potentially a very dangerous person.
Yeah, dangerous, not just in his ways of taking over, but also when he comes into power, when he fully assumes control of the church, if you will. He starts these really strong beliefs, I guess, if you will, his new doctrine, if you will. One of the doctrines that he established with the people is that everyone there, except for him, needed to be celibate. Mm-hmm. And that he, because God had chosen him, he would have the opportunity to sleep with some of the married women of the group, but also some of the unmarried. And he had this goal. He believed that he needed to father 25 children. Yep. 24 children. And if he fathered 24 children, then they would sit on the 24 heavenly thrones as recorded there in the Bible. And he also stated that he was the Lamb of God, the individual that the book of Revelation talks about, who will unlock the seven seals and will bring about the end times. And so these people are looking at him not just as some leader who kind of came in with guns blazing. They're looking at him like this prophet, the Lamb of God, and that it is up to him who will signal the end of times and will allow Christ to return. And therefore, they must do whatever he says, no matter what. And so that's where people start seeing that maybe this is a cult instead of a religious group.
Yeah, and David Koresh, I think what made him so dangerous, not just that he was willing to shoot someone that was his potential rival for leadership within the group, but also because, according to all accounts, he was very knowledgeable of the Bible. He knew the Bible, he knew the book of Revelation quite well. And so he was, of course, able to manipulate that material and misrepresent it to people who maybe did not know as much about it as he did. And he was able to really mislead these people. You talk about the number of women in the compound he was allowed to, he was sleeping with. Some of these women he was sleeping with, though, were not women. They were girls as young as 12 and 13 years old. And several of them, of course, became pregnant. There's also, of course, a lot of concern, not just simply about the mental and spiritual manipulation that's going on there, the physical abuse that's going on there. There's also the concern about the way he disciplined some of these members. He viewed himself as a very authoritarian figure. So, of course, he was willing to um, do whatever he needed to do to keep his people in line. You know, you think about Jim Jones and some of the things they did to keep people in line, you know, and David Koresh was no exception to that. And of course, so he views himself, like you said, as this Lamb of God, this sort of fulfillment of the book of Revelation, or some of the prophecies in the book of Revelation. He predicts that the apocalypse is near, and that they needed to do everything they could to protect themselves. So they began to stockpile weapons and explosives there at the Mount Carmel location in Waco, Texas, to prepare for what they believed was coming. And Chris, there's no doubt in my mind, most of the people, if not all of the people in that compound, believed everything David Koresh said. And when he said the end is near and we need to do the following things, you know, stockpile weapons, etc., they were willing to do it.
And I think it's also important that we understand it's easy for us to say, well, you know, these must have just been people who were uneducated, and that they were just, you know, following this lost shepherd just because they didn't know anything better. But, you know, what we need to understand is that the people here in at Mount Carmel, these Branch Davidians, they had jobs in the town. They went to dinner in town. They interacted freely with the outside world. They were multi-ethnic. They were multinational, and they were far more educated than, you know, just some rural doomsday cult might suggest. Actually, though David Koresh was a high school dropout, you know, two of his most trusted followers, one's name was Wayne Martin, who was a lawyer for David Koresh, and another guy was like his right-hand man, Schneider. They had degrees from like Harvard and Hawaii. So these are not just people who are uneducated and just following along blindly. They have truly, to use the expression, drank the Kool-Aid, if you will. And I think, you know, what happens is not everybody believes and not everybody agrees with what David Koresh is doing. And some of these individuals start to catch wind and thinking that, hey, this guy is doing some things that are wrong. He's committing child abuse. He's not paying taxes. He's doing some crazy statutory rape with some of these spiritual wives that you would see. And so that caused some of the government officials to get involved. I know that Department of Social Services was called. And it was interesting that a lady from the DSS actually went and visited the compound and met one of David's wives and met some of the children. But as she talked to them and as she wanted to find out, is there anything illegal going on here? The response that she got from them was that everything was good. Everything was fine. There were no issues. And it was I guess you could say, a miracle or divine intervention. We don't know really what it was, but it just so happened in 1992 that a UPS driver was just doing his normal delivery and headed to the Mount Carmel, to the Branch Davidian compound. And when he went to get the package off the truck that he would normally take to, you know, leave on the door, it wasn't tight, and it fell, and out came these grenade casings. And the UPS driver flipped out because he didn't know what on earth was going on at this armed guard Mount Carmel. So he goes home, calls local law enforcement, and the alcohol, tobacco, firearms begins to open an investigation that maybe there's possible federal weapons violations. And that basically leads to the tragedy that unfolds on Sunday, February 28, 1993.
Yeah, and that day is February 28, 1993. The Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms goes to the Mount Carmel location to serve out warrants against Koresh and others there at the compound. And of course, when the ATF arrives, they enter into a several hour-long gunfight with people inside the compound there at Waco. During this gunfight, 6 of the Branch Davidians were dead. 4 ATF agents were dead. And that, of course, led to the 51-day standoff that we had talked about earlier. the long standoff that, of course, is going to end on April 19, 1993, with the death of most of the people in the compound.
Yeah, I think that this event on Sunday, February 28th, really starts the whole conversation as to what goes wrong long before we get to that 51-day standoff, because, you know, they called it Operation Trojan Horse. And you have these dozens of agents that are in this full tactical gear that are just going straight to the Branch Davidian compound. And, you know, the question that you have to ask yourself is, what had gone on previously to think that this religious organization was so dangerous that it was going to require all of these guns and manpower and all to actually to go and to serve a warrant for maybe the arrest of Koresh, and also to search the compound. What the ATF didn't know is that Koresh had been preaching to his congregation that there was going to be this end times biblical confrontation between good and evil, and the good was the Branch Davidians and the evil was the government, and that the government was going to basically come and was going to barge in and tell them that what they were saying was wrong, what they were doing was wrong, and that they were going to lose all controls of freedom. And what happens is that it just happened to be this news cameraman who was hanging out on the street, and he actually didn't really know what was going on. And I think that a postal worker kind of stopped by, and the cameraman said, "Yeah, I'm here checking in some things. I've seen a lot of activity or whatever's going on." And it just happened that the postman was a member of the Branch Davidian. And so he ran back to Mount Carmel and told David Koresh, "Hey, law enforcement's going to be paying a visit," which I think is what kind of caused David Koresh to say, "Okay, guys, here it is. This is the battle. This is what we were talking about was going to come." And so all of a sudden, you know, you have this major conflict, which will then lead into the 51-day standoff. And Ray, when we think about that 51-day standoff, there was a lot of tense negotiations that were going on during that time. But you also had the federal government that was being watched by international as well as national news. And they didn't want to look bad, first of all, by going in against women and children, but second of all, by a group of small religious group preventing the government from doing its job. So they found themselves in a very tough place as well.
Yeah, you know, and David Koresh in many ways sort of created his own prophecy, and then created its own fulfillment, at least in the minds of many of his followers there. Because, you know, by stockpiling weapons and explosives and doing a lot of things he was doing, they were inevitably going to get the attention of the authorities. And then when the authorities came in on February 28, 1992, they, of course, the people there in the compound viewed this as the fulfillment of the prophecy that David Koresh had been giving them all that time. And of course, during that 51-day standoff, Chris, you know this, they turned lights on the compound to try to make it very uncomfortable. They played loud music, which would try to make everybody uncomfortable. So, you know, to give the government, I guess, some leeway here, is that they did try, at least to some degree, to resolve this situation through negotiation and through other tactics. But of course, we know it did not work. And in April 19, 1993, it came to a head there as the authorities went in and began putting tear gas into the building. Of course, leading to that, on April 18th, Attorney General at that time, Janet Reno, approved the tear gas assault on the compound there. And on April 19 at around 6 a.m., the Branch Davidians were told, you know, they were warned, this is getting ready to happen. You know, I guess after 51 days, the government had said, or had decided, that enough's enough. We need to go ahead and put an end to this now. But of course, the use of tear gas is going to become one of the most controversial flashpoints over this. Did it cause the fire that ultimately destroyed the compound and killed so many people in it? Or or did the people in the compound, set the fires themselves? That's going to be the big controversy for quite some time, until 1999, in fact, when the FBI did admit that they used tear gas in the assault. And of course, tear gas is not non-flammable, if that makes any sense. It is flammable, and it could very well have caused the fire that killed the people in the building.
Yeah, as the nation, we have to remember that this is really one of the first breaking news events that the nation is just drawn to. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, a nation as well as an international audience is tuning in to observe and watch every detail that is going on. And the federal government was able to get some of the individuals out, but for the most part, as you mentioned, David Koresh was basically seemingly setting this up for a final battle. The government had allowed him the opportunity to record some of his messages and his beliefs that was played on a radio station. And that was part of the deal, that if you do that, then you'll surrender. And Koresh had agreed to that. And then when that was given, when the government allowed that to happen, Koresh basically turned around and said no. And then they said, look, you've got to release these people. And he said, well, when I'm finished interpreting the 7 seals, when I'm finished writing the 7 seals, then we'll come out. And the government was like, we've given you enough time. This is the day. And they pushed those projectiles, those tanks with the tear gas. They pushed it into the actual building. They hit the doors and they hit the windows. And, I think the federal government really thought that when we put some tear gas in, immediately we're going to see a lot of people walk out, because you're not going to be able, they knew they had children in there and women were in there, and as well as the men, but they knew that once the tear gas affected the buildings, people were going to have to come out. David Koresh had thought ahead of the game, and he had made sure that all of them had gas masks. And so they immediately put their gas mask on while this assault, according to the Branch Davidians, while this assault is going on by the federal government. You have the women and the children that are in the chapel who are praying and who are really seeking God's wisdom. David Koresh, who is in another part of the building, having been injured in the previous assault, the one that first took place, he's in there studying, reading his Bible, but ultimately preparing for the end of days. We don't know exactly what happened, but what we do know is that as the government was putting the tear gas in and with their tanks, that the Branch Davidians had gas cans inside the building there. And there is evidence through FBI bugging or eavesdropping that heard some of the Branch Davidians that were saying, pour it now, which led to the belief that the Branch Davidians were pouring gasoline into the building, and that possibly one of the projectiles hit the gas, which caused it to go in flames. But what we also know is that after everything is finished, David Koresh did not die from asphyxiation from the fumes. He didn't die from the fire. He died from a gunshot wound. So what the theory seems to be is that Koresh, along with several of his most trusted people, had a suicide pact and killed themselves, while many others burned to death because they were unable to escape.
Yeah, he abandoned his followers. They were following him literally to death, and instead of sticking with them to the end, he abandoned them and killed himself. Of course, there were over 80 people, or at least 80 people, that were killed that day on April 19, 1993. 22 of those were children. And of course, like we said earlier, this is a very controversial event among a lot of people, because there are still people who view this as the government overreaching, that this was a private religious sect and that they should be allowed to have their religion the way they want to practice it. And of course, there's other people there who said that they had become a threat to the children within the compound and possibly even to the larger community.
So there's no doubt, right, that this is a tragedy. Regardless of how this happened, the efforts of the government and what they did, and the efforts of the Branch Davidians, it is interesting that on April 20th, 1993, which was the day after the fire, there was a CNN Gallup poll that said that 73% of Americans thought that the FBI had acted responsibly at the compound, and 93% had blamed Koresh for the death of his followers. What happens is, as time develops and people start hearing more and you start getting into these conspiracy theories and people start talking, there begins to be a slight movement away from that, away from the government having treated this properly. And basically on April 19th, 1995, which is the second anniversary of the fire, the vast majority of Americans are going to change their view when a man whose name was Timothy McVeigh parked a truck with like 4,800 pounds of explosives in front of the federal building in downtown Oklahoma City that would kill 167 people, 19 of them being children. And the reason that many suspect that Timothy McVeigh did that is because he thought that the government had created committed mass murder at Mount Carmel 2 years previously. So that causes the nation to go back and think about the government's actions towards people just in general. And that led to this large report being done by a former Arizona senator, I think, or it might not have been Arizona. It was the Senator John Danforth, I think was the name. They called it the Danforth Report. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so, basically there becomes these questions, did the FBI act maybe a little too harsh in the way that they treated these particular events to take place? And that leads John Danforth to be a lead an account into, okay, what actually happened there at Waco. And he basically says, listen, the government did some things that were wrong. They could have handled this a lot better. But the issue comes back to what David Koresh did. That David Koresh, as you said so eloquently earlier, that he left his followers, that he led them to the place he wanted, and then he said, I'm done with you. And I think at the end of the day, that it comes back to that David Koresh wasn't a messiah, but rather was a killer.
Yeah. That things were not as Koresh, of course, had claimed they were. And in many ways, Chris, I think it's fair to say that Koresh created the situation, and ultimately it ended in some way the way he wanted it to end, in this apocalyptic and this fiery apocalyptic scene there, unfortunately taking the lives of 80 of his followers and 22 children in the process. So I think once we think about this, we have to go, of course, like we said earlier, to the issues of freedom of religion and freedom of speech. Did the government violate the freedom of religion or freedom of speech of David Koresh and his followers, or had they somewhere crossed the line with the purchasing of the weapons and the explosives and all of that kind of stuff? So what do you think, Chris?
I think there's a lot of unanswered questions. I think that one of the major things that kind of caused the government to go in a different direction is when the ATF lost control of the situation and the FBI took over it. I think that the ATF had an understanding of maybe how these people operated because they had been investigating and researching and doing these particular things. And then when you show up with cattle trailers full of armed guards or armed, officers to serve a warrant, and your pastor has been preaching that there's going to be a biblical confrontation between good and evil, which is the government and religion, you could just see that this was happening. It was going to turn out ugly. And the thing is, the Branch Davidians didn't want to die inside their compound at Mount Carmel. I think the only one who wanted to die was David Koresh. I truly believe the other ones didn't want to be tear gassed. They didn't want to be trapped. They didn't want to be burned alive next to their children. And I think that there were some people in the FBI and the ATF who knew that. Because if you look at what happened over 51 days, what happened is they talked. They talked, not Koresh necessarily, but Koresh's main men talked to the FBI. There were things that were being in place. And I think that the FBI had had enough. They were tired of being embarrassed that they couldn't control a small group of religious people. And so they just had to go in. And when the FBI said they were going in with everything that they had. And I think David Koresh was all in. And unfortunately, the victims are the people who were caught in the middle, who couldn't escape because there was a takeout door right outside their door. And they thought that if I escape, they'll shoot me.
Yep.
But if I stay here, I'll die. I think that the majority of Branch Davidians were in a no-win situation because they feared the government because of what they had been preached to. And they feared their leader who didn't offer a way out. That's why we call it the tragedy at Waco.
Yeah, definitely a tragedy. And I think when we think about issues of freedom of religion, First Amendment, and all that kind of stuff, the way I always think about this, Chris, is that your rights end when they begin infringing on another person's rights. And, the rights of the children in the compound who didn't, who couldn't just get up and walk out, and they were being abused and mistreated by at least David Koresh. That's something that I think the government rightly had to respond to. And also the apparent, at least the way the government saw it at the time's militarization of Mount Carmel there in Waco.
And I do think that we always talk about we need to learn from history, and we need to make sure that things do not happen the same way ever again. And I do think that the FBI saw the events at Mount Carmel and recognized that changes need to be made. And I think because of the report that came out, but also different things the Attorney General has put in place, if we look at certain situations that happen nowadays, I do think that the FBI has tended to become more apt at trying to handle it through negotiations rather than bringing in the tanks. I don't recall a situation in the last few years in which there was a standoff like this, in which the FBI used the same measures that they used back at Mount Carmel in Waco, Texas. So I do think that the government has learned, and the government does try to respect one's right to religion and one's right to speech. But as you said, that when it does infringe upon the safety and the well-being of others, then it's time to act. You have the right to believe what you want to believe, but you must also respect life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And once you derail from that, we have no choice but for the government to exercise its power to assure life and liberty for all individuals. I think it's a fascinating story. A lot of lessons that we can learn and have learned. And what's sad about it, just to be honest, is that it could have been prevented. That's what breaks my heart about this whole story, is I really think there could have been a different ending.
Yeah. There definitely could have been a different ending, and it's just such a sad account. Chris, thank you for all your research and work on this particular episode. We hope our listeners have enjoyed this episode on the tragedy at Waco. If you would like to contact us to get more information, make comments, you can contact us at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know, @gmail.com. You can also find us on Sounder FM, Spotify, and Google Podcast, Facebook, and Twitter. We hope you will check us out. And until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
Talk to you later.